Banning!
Body horror, otherwise known as biological horror, is a little-known subgenre that is distinctly categorized through its portrayal of graphic and psychologically disturbing imagery, in particular to the human body. These are movies that'll either gross you out or blow your mind. It's often portrayed with things like aberrant sex, mutations, mutilation, gratuitous violence, disease, unnatural movement of the body, and technically zombification. Even though zombie movies technically fall under the umbrella of body horror, they've been done so much in recent years that mainstream audiences simply see it as its own subgenre of horror. According to film scholar Linda Williams, body horror is comparable to two other subgenres, those that are referred to as the genres of excess, those being body horror, melodrama, and pornography. Often, the success of these genres is measured by the degree to which the audience sensation mimics what is depicted on screen. Melodrama, wielding extreme sadness,
Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
horror movies play upon your deepest fears, and of course, your sexual arousal through pornography. These movies, under the body horror umbrella, achieve these reactions through stories focused on the human body's absolute limit of transformative and manipulative capabilities. It is undoubtedly very niche and often overlooked. Its genre ingredients are often seen in other film categories, blurring the line between a true body horror film and, say, a slasher flick. Mutations or mutilations are staples of these stories, but are also tropes used in monster, slasher, and splatter films. This can make it rare to pin any horror movie as just body horror. Just like any action movie can also be a comedy, and a western can also be a sci-fi. These traits have spanned the many genres and mediums, finding its way into movies such as Akira and even Naked Gun. A common factor that separates a true body horror film from the rest is that the violations and distortions of the character's physical form is rarely a result from immediate or initial violence. Instead, it is superseded by the character's lack of any sort of conscious control, whether it's through mutation, disease, or invasion of the body. Think of Jason Voorhees impaling an unsuspecting victim, compared to the chestburster from Alien. Through its initial infiltration, then lay dormant. Unbeknownst to the host, its fertilization will spawn something even more terrifying. Then it does that one thing. The terminology for body horror was first used by Philip Brophy in a 1989 article. But even though the term was coined in 1989, body horror as a trope had existed prior to its screen adaptation. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one of the earliest examples of fictional writing to utilize these tropes. With the success of Gothic horror and the emergence of science fiction, it's believed the combination of these two led to the birth of body horror as a literary genre, with the likes of H.P. Lovecraft, Clive Barker, and Stephen King being some of the notable influences. The depiction of horror in its cinematic form has evolved alongside our increasing tolerance for violence on screen. From Frankenstein in 1931 to Evil Dead 2 in 1987, a lot has changed. And our tolerance threshold is thought to have developed sometime around post-World War II era with the emergence of television. Although many film scholars draw the line at 1968, with movies released prior being classical horror and the latter postmodern. The distinction of classical horror movies are more black and white, visually, and the morality of characters. They usually rely on dialogue to drive the horror less than showing, due in part to the capabilities of their visual effects. And they also end with a more solid resolution. Whereas postmodern horror films blur the line between good and evil.
You have my sympathies.
We see more cases of strong heroines as the main protagonists. Practical effects have achieved significantly more believable levels, allowing these films to depict the spectacle of the ruined body. In contrast to classical horror, these endings are often more ambiguous, and can even end with the monster prevailing. At the forefront of these postmodern body horror films are filmmakers David Cronenberg and John Carpenter, both having claim to fame in the 70s and 80s. David Cronenberg is often considered to be the originator of body horror, although these tropes had existed prior to Cronenberg's Hollywood debut with films such as The Blob and the original The Fly from the 1950s. Therefore, Cronenberg didn't necessarily invent body horror, but through his story's surreal and sometimes grotesque depictions of the subject matter, the success of his films brought a greater attention to body horror as a subgenre, only years later for the term to be officially coined. The 70s and 80s were the golden age of visceral special effects through practical means, comparatively to the 21st century, where practical was mostly replaced with CGI. The end results are completely subjective, but no one can deny the craft and artistry that went into the practical rigs, the dummies, and the mechanical faces that forever separated this subgenre from just another scary story. Even now, we are seeing a renaissance of sorts in Hollywood of a return to practical effects. The stories that encapsulate this subgenre can be so surreal and grotesque, and yet we can't look away. This is a genre where its rise in popularity coincided with a worldwide epidemic, arguably causing the subject matter to resonate more with this audience at the time. These intense, invoked feelings of psychological and physical disgust are because these stories play upon the anxieties of our physical vulnerability, the fear of what's inside us, and the dread of not being able to control it.